A racist and prejudiced cop kicked a black woman inside a courtroom and froze in place when she made the shocking revelation that she was an FBI agent. But what happened to that cop after the truth came out, shocked everyone. He didn't know. That was the real tragedy. He thought he was in control, always had been. He wore the badge, the uniform, the arrogance of someone who believed the law bent at his will. He'd stared at her like she was less than human, like she was just another body to push around, another mouth to silence. But this time, he had no idea who she really was. What she carried. What she came there to do. The courtroom was packed, a quiet tension hanging in the air. The trial in question was minor, almost forgettable, at least on the surface. But she wasn't there by accident. She wasn't just an observer. She was there with purpose, seated silently in the back row, eyes sharp, waiting. Not for the trial, but for him. She had followed his file for months. Patterns. Complaints. Hidden cases swept under rugs. Victims too afraid to speak. There were whispers in communities across the city, stories passed between mothers and sons about a cop who never paid for what he did. And then, it happened. The cop walked in with the swagger of someone untouchable. His eyes scanned the room like a hunter sizing up prey. When he saw her, something shifted. He didn't recognize her identity, but he recognized her defiance. That was enough to provoke him. "Get off your phone," he barked, voice echoing through the courtroom like a threat, not a request. She didn't move. She wasn't on her phone. She simply held it. Calmly. Quietly. He stepped closer. "I said give me the phone, now." She looked up, her voice firm but respectful. "You don't have the authority to search or seize my personal property without a warrant." A pause. A flicker of disbelief in his eyes. Then rage. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as his boot struck her side, knocking her backward against the bench, her phone skittering across the floor. Gasps erupted. The bailiff flinched. The judge froze. And for one searing second, the only sound was her shallow breath, her body folding into itself on the floor, and the phone, screen cracked, lying still near her feet. He didn't just hurt her physically, he tried to erase her. Reduce her. Humiliate her. But then, she stood. Slowly. With intention. Her eyes never left his. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, and what she pulled out was not a weapon, at least not in the traditional sense. It was a badge. The room didn't erupt. It suffocated. Everyone froze. Federal Bureau of Investigation. His smirk vanished. His hands fell to his sides. His chest stopped rising. That was the moment everything he thought he knew collapsed. Because now the power he abused had just been turned against him, legally, publicly, and irreversibly. But that wasn't even the beginning of the reckoning. She wasn't there for the trial. She was there for him. She had spent over a year working on a confidential case investigating patterns of racial abuse and excessive force in the police department. His name came up again and again. But never with enough proof. Never with enough courage from the victims to bring him down. So she made a choice. She went undercover. She waited. She provoked. And when he took the bait, when he chose violence in a room full of witnesses, she knew it was over. What no one expected, what made jaws drop and people stand, was what came next. She turned to the judge and addressed the court, not as a victim, but as a federal agent. She explained the file in her hand, the testimonies collected, the body cam footage altered, the internal affairs reports buried. She called for his immediate suspension. She requested his arrest on multiple charges. And then the judge, who had watched everything unfold with a tightened jaw and clenched fists, nodded in silence. No words. Just a signal to the bailiff. The same officer who had once barked orders and strutted with invincibility, now found himself standing still, arms out as another officer handcuffed him in front of the entire courtroom. But the moment that shook everyone to their core wasn't the arrest. It was when the crowd, citizens, attorneys, even a few officers, stood and clapped. They didn't clap because justice had been done. They clapped because, for the first time, someone had the strength to fight back from inside the system and win. That woman who had been kicked to the ground now stood taller than anyone in the room. Her silence had been power. Her patience had been strategy. Her pain had been turned into purpose. But what no one knew, what not even he knew, was what she had discovered about him in the process of building her case. There was a secret buried deep in his past. Something that, if exposed, wouldn't just destroy his career, it would unravel the very system that protected him for so long. And she held that secret in her hand. The real question is, when the truth finally comes out, will justice be enough? Or will it tear everything down with it? Stay with us. Because this story is far from over. Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every Black viewer watching this video. We see you. We hear you. And we stand with you. Here at Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism, prejudice, or any form of injustice. Our stories are meant to amplify voices, provoke thought, and inspire change. This story is a powerful reminder that truth, courage, and dignity can't be silenced, no matter how hard the world tries. Enjoy the story. And if you're moved by what you hear today, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It really helps us continue telling stories that matter. Let's begin. The morning sun in Shreveport, Louisiana, poured through the blinds in narrow slits, casting uneven light over a modest, sparsely decorated apartment that belonged to Alicia Monroe. Every inch of the space spoke of quiet discipline and deliberate simplicity, the books stacked by topic on the shelves, the clean countertops, the lone photo on the side table, a smiling woman in her 20s standing beside an older couple. That woman was Alicia. And in that frozen moment, you wouldn't guess the weight she carried behind her eyes. Alicia wasn't a woman you noticed immediately in a room, not unless you were paying close attention. Her walk was precise, confident but controlled, as if every movement was calculated. Her voice was measured, warm but firm, the kind that made people pause and actually listen. Raised in the Queensboro neighborhood of Shreveport, she grew up in a family that never had much but taught her that dignity was non-negotiable. Her father, Walter, was a Vietnam veteran turned bus mechanic who believed silence was often louder than shouting. Her mother, Gloria, worked as a school secretary for nearly 30 years and kept an iron spine behind a gentle smile. They raised Alicia to stand tall, even when people tried to cut her down at the knees. That lesson had been tested again and again throughout her life, in school, on the street, even in college where she often found herself one of the only Black women in her criminology classes. But Alicia wasn't built to surrender. She watched. She listened. She planned. And above all, she endured. By the time she was in her early 30s, Alicia had not only joined the FBI, she had carved a space for herself in one of the Bureau's most difficult and emotionally demanding divisions, civil rights investigations focused on law enforcement corruption. She didn't take the job for glory. She took it because she'd seen what injustice looked like up close. Because she knew that if people like her weren't inside those rooms, then those rooms would never change. Still, being on the inside came at a price. There were places she couldn't walk without suspicion. People who still questioned her credentials. Supervisors who smiled politely while giving her the most thankless cases. And there was always the quiet pressure to do her job perfectly, without emotion, without error, as if any misstep would be used as proof that she didn't belong there in the first place. But Alicia had learned long ago that the truth didn't need to shout to be heard, it only needed the right moment. That moment was coming. On the other side of Shreveport, inside the police precinct on Fairfield Avenue, Officer Todd Kincaid was finishing his morning coffee and polishing the edge of his badge for the third time. Todd was the kind of cop that made people nervous for the wrong reasons. His record looked clean on paper, but his reputation in black and brown communities told a different story. He was known for over-policing, aggressive stops, and attitude problems, euphemisms the department used to avoid naming what people really whispered behind closed doors. Todd was dangerous. And not because he didn't follow the rules, but because he knew exactly how to bend them without getting caught. He'd been on the force for over a decade. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a permanent smirk etched into his face, Todd carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never truly been challenged. He saw himself as a protector of order, and anyone who questioned that was, to him, part of the problem. His authority had gone unchecked for years, and he believed in his own untouchability. He had friends in the department, favors owed, and most importantly, plausible deniability. To the public, he was a decorated officer. To his fellow cops, he was loyal. To his victims, he was a shadow with a badge. The city courthouse, an aging stone building on Texas Street, was hosting a small hearing that afternoon, one involving a juvenile defendant accused of theft. A routine case on the docket, the kind that would normally pass without incident. Todd had been called in to testify regarding the arrest, as he was the responding officer. It was supposed to be a quick day, in and out. But that day, in that courtroom, nothing would go according to plan. Alicia had been preparing for this operation for months. She'd studied Todd's movements, his reports, the patterns of complaints that kept disappearing from the internal database. She had spoken in hushed tones with mothers and sons who bore invisible bruises. Most of them refused to go on record. Fear, shame, and exhaustion had silenced them. But Alicia had learned long ago that one documented act of brutality in public view would speak louder than a dozen silent stories. So she waited. And watched. And placed herself where he would least expect her. She arrived at the courthouse dressed like any other civilian. No heels, no badge, no visible authority. Just a long gray coat, jeans, and a calm demeanor. Her seat in the back row of the courtroom was chosen carefully, not too close, not too distant. Just enough for him to see her and feel in control. She knew his type. Men like Todd thrived on control. They only lashed out when they felt it slipping. At exactly 2:37 p.m., Todd entered the courtroom. His eyes swept across the room lazily, pausing slightly when they landed on Alicia. Something about her posture irritated him. She wasn't looking away like most people did. She was looking straight back at him. He didn't recognize her, at least not consciously. But his gut told him she was a problem. The trial hadn't started yet. People were chatting in low tones. A child cried in the hallway. A clerk fumbled with paperwork. And Alicia? She sat still, holding her phone loosely in her hand, checking a file that had nothing to do with the juvenile on trial. She was watching him. Todd moved closer, stepping over to where she sat. He didn't ask questions. He gave orders. Put the phone away. Alicia raised her head slightly, her voice calm. I'm not disrupting anything. I'm reviewing court materials. He frowned. I said, put the damn phone away. You don't get to argue. The tension in the room thickened. A few heads turned. Alicia didn't flinch. You don't have the right to search or seize my phone. I haven't broken any laws. That was when something in Todd snapped. He didn't shout. He acted. A boot, a lunge, a motion too fast for most to register until the sound echoed through the marble halls, a body hitting the floor, a gasp, a shattered phone sliding across tile. Time froze. And in that moment, the power dynamic that Todd had built his whole identity on began to crumble. Everyone saw it. Everyone heard it. And no one moved to stop it. Not right away. What followed would unravel everything. But no one in that courtroom knew it yet. Not the judge. Not the bailiff. Not even Alicia. Because this wasn't just about a phone, or a badge, or a trial. This was about a system cracking from the inside. And while Todd stood over her, chest heaving, unaware of what he had just triggered, Alicia slowly gathered herself from the floor. In that split second before she rose, before the world turned upside down, she thought of every name that had disappeared into silence. Every file she had memorized. Every tearful voice that said, "He'll never get caught." And now, everything was finally in motion. But the question still hung in the air, unspoken but heavy, when the curtain is pulled back, and the truth stands tall in front of the world. Will justice be enough? Or will something bigger finally collapse? Let the story begin. Alicia stood with her coat slightly open, her phone still cracked on the floor behind her, and her ribs throbbing in a dull rhythm. The courtroom was silent, almost too silent, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from confusion, disbelief, and fear. All eyes flickered between her and Officer Kincaid. The bailiff hesitated. The judge hadn't yet entered. Some people started murmuring in hushed tones, unsure whether they'd just witnessed an accident or something darker. Alicia didn't flinch. She brushed dust off her sleeve and locked her eyes onto Kincaid, who was already starting to regret everything but didn't dare show it. His face remained stiff, but a vein near his temple pulsed violently. She could see the calculations behind his stare, how quickly he was scrambling to build a defense in his mind. "Are you going to arrest me for not handing you my property?" Alicia's voice was low but unwavering, heard clearly even in the tense quiet. Kincaid crossed his arms and looked around the courtroom, trying to find someone to back him up. The clerk avoided his gaze. A public defender whispered something to her client and kept glancing at Alicia. "You were being non-compliant," Kincaid muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You were interrupting court procedures." "Court hadn't started," Alicia said, letting her voice cut through the space like a blade. "And reviewing files on a public device doesn't constitute interruption." She paused, looking around slowly. "But assaulting a civilian does." The murmur grew louder. Someone gasped. One man in the gallery stood and walked out, clearly uncomfortable. Another person, a young black woman with her child on her lap, nodded quietly. Kincaid stepped back. "Watch your mouth," he snapped. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Alicia's eyes didn't blink. "No, Officer Kincaid. I think you already made it as bad as it could possibly be." The judge entered moments later, forcing order back into the room. The case they were all technically gathered for resumed. But the air had shifted. Eyes kept sliding toward the back row. Kincaid's testimony came and went. The juvenile defendant was given a deferment and released to his guardian. Alicia remained seated, still, quiet. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, Kincaid lit a cigarette behind the building, leaning against the red bricks like he had every day for years. But his hands weren't steady. His partner, a younger officer named Greer, joined him. Greer was nervous. "Man, what the hell was that?" Kincaid exhaled smoke, trying to shrug it off. "Just another one of these activists. Thinks they can play lawyer and start drama. She'll make a complaint. Internal Affairs will skim it. They always do. She'll get tired, drop it, disappear." Greer wasn't so sure. She didn't look like she was bluffing. She didn't look scared either. She didn't have to, Kincaid snapped. Because people like her have gotten used to pushing it too far. They know we're under a microscope. They know the department won't back us like before. He flicked the cigarette to the ground. "I've seen this before. They come in loud. Then they go quiet." But Alicia wasn't going anywhere. She was already in her car, parked 2 blocks away, removing her coat, changing her shoes, wiping blood from the corner of her mouth. In the passenger seat was a manila folder marked confidential in red letters. Inside were photos, names, transcripts, timestamps, audio files, everything she had collected on Kincaid for the last 9 months. She added a new entry to the log, subject engaged violently in public courtroom setting. Unprovoked force used against non-aggressive target. Multiple witnesses. Public record pending. She closed the folder and leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. She didn't need to react with rage or chaos. She had what she needed. The system that once felt like a stone wall was beginning to show cracks. Back at the precinct, Kincaid returned to his desk and found 2 missed calls from Internal Affairs. He furrowed his brow. His supervisor, Captain Ellis, was already looking at him through the office window. Alicia had filed the first complaint, officially. But that wasn't the real threat. It was the exposure. She didn't just want him punished. She wanted him proven. The next few days moved like a storm brewing quietly under the surface. Kincaid was called in for questioning. His use of force report didn't match the courtroom video. The footage from the courthouse lobby showed him approaching Alicia aggressively. The audio was clear. His words, his tone, her response, it was all there. No matter how many times he insisted she was disruptive, the video told a different story. Meanwhile, Alicia was summoned to Washington. She met with a senior agent in the Civil Rights Unit. Her report was thorough, her documentation unassailable. Still, her supervisor warned her. You're not just going after a bad cop. You're going after a legacy. If you press this, there will be resistance from every angle. Alicia didn't flinch. Let them resist. At night, she sat in her apartment, reviewing her files, remembering the faces of those who had come forward only to vanish in paperwork limbo. There was Marcus, 16 years old, who had a broken wrist and no official record of the stop that caused it. Linda, a single mother, whose teenage son had been arrested for loitering outside his own apartment complex. Darren, who claimed his dashcam footage was erased after a routine traffic stop. The cases piled up, but no one had ever drawn the line directly to Kincaid, until now. But Alicia knew better than to think evidence alone would bring justice. It had to happen publicly. Irrefutably. There had to be a moment, a break in the dam, where everything came crashing down. That moment was closer than anyone realized. Kincaid grew agitated. His colleagues began to keep distance. Word spread, quiet, cautious. There was a woman, they said. She wasn't just another civilian. She was federal. She was watching everything. The tension inside the department mounted. Rumors about investigations, subpoenas, administrative leaves. Kincaid's record, once protected, was now being peeled apart layer by layer. He tried to play it cool. Dinners with old friends. Calls to former favors. But something was shifting. The power he once relied on wasn't answering the phone anymore. And then, the invitation arrived. A public hearing, scheduled to review the conduct of Officer Todd Kincaid. Witnesses would be present. Media would attend. Statements would be made. Alicia was on the list to speak. Kincaid sat in his car that night, parked behind the station, fists clenched around the steering wheel. He replayed the courtroom moment in his mind again and again, but each time it ended the same, with her rising to her feet, calm, unshaken, watching him with eyes that said, "I already won." Inside her apartment, Alicia prepared. Not with revenge in her heart, but with a quiet urgency that came from years of silence. She went over her files, not looking for new proof, but making sure every piece fit perfectly. This wasn't just about him. It was about every door that had been slammed in someone's face, every mother that had cried behind a closed courtroom door, every whispered fear that went unreported because nobody would listen. Now, they would. And still, there was one more thing she hadn't revealed. One final card. A truth no one had seen coming. Because what she found inside Kincaid's personnel file went beyond him. It went to the very core of the department. And when she brought it to light, everything would change. The question is, are they ready to hear it? The courtroom was different this time. Not just because of the lighting or the crowd, it was the air itself, thicker, charged, tense in a way that made every breath feel like it might set something off. Cameras were set in corners, their lenses silently blinking red. Reporters filled the benches, holding pens they weren't using because no one dared look down. The judge hadn't yet entered, but the room was already heavy with expectation. In the front row, Alicia sat perfectly still, dressed in a navy blue suit, not flashy, not aggressive, just precise. Every line of fabric told the same story: she came here prepared to end something. To finish it. Kincaid walked in 10 minutes late. Not because he meant to disrespect the court, but because he needed every second to compose the version of himself he wanted people to see. His tie was too tight. His palms damp. His usual swagger was there, but it was forced, like he had to remember each step as he took it. His lawyer followed close behind, whispering something into his ear, but Kincaid didn't respond. His eyes had already found Alicia, and when they did, something flickered behind them: recognition, regret, and maybe, for the first time, fear. The judge entered. The murmurs died. Everyone stood, and then everyone sat. The clerk called the hearing into session. The purpose was clear: a review of Officer Kincaid's conduct, specifically regarding a violent incident that had occurred in this very building. But this wasn't about one act. Not anymore. The court knew it. The department knew it. Kincaid knew it. And Alicia was about to make sure the entire country knew it too. The first part of the hearing was procedural: video playback of the incident, witness testimonies, courtroom footage. The screen didn't lie. Kincaid flinched each time his voice echoed back at him from the speakers. His lawyer objected, minimized, reframed. But the footage was undeniable. What had once been whispers was now visual fact. Still, he kept his jaw set, his eyes forward, waiting for the moment to pass. Hoping the storm would end before it reached him fully. Then Alicia stood. She walked to the front with a folder in hand, her heels tapping softly on the floor, measured, deliberate. She placed the folder on the witness table, opened it slowly, and spoke in a voice that carried without effort. "My name is Alicia Monroe. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. I am also the individual assaulted by Officer Todd Kincaid on March 4th of this year. I am here today not as a victim, but as the lead investigator in an ongoing federal inquiry into systemic abuse within the Shreveport Police Department, with Officer Kincaid named as a primary subject." There was no gasp. No dramatic shift. Just the sound of silence deepening, pressing into every chest like weight. She continued. "For the last 11 months, I have gathered statements, reviewed documents, analyzed case files, and compiled a record of behavior that demonstrates a consistent pattern of misconduct, racially motivated aggression, and falsified documentation related to Officer Kincaid's arrests and use of force. This pattern, hidden behind department bureaucracy and protected by internal relationships, has led to wrongful detainments, unreported injuries, and emotional trauma from multiple citizens, most of them black." The judge nodded for her to proceed. Kincaid's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Alicia turned to the screen where exhibits were being displayed. One by one, she walked through evidence. Photos of bruises. Redacted reports. Call logs that vanished. Bodycam footage mysteriously missing audio. And then, an internal memo written by Kincaid himself that contradicted sworn testimony given in another hearing just months prior. Still, it wasn't until Alicia closed the folder and looked directly at Kincaid that the courtroom began to feel like it might combust from within. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You remember Marcus Hightower?" she asked, eyes locked on him. 16 years old. Said he resisted arrest. Claimed he ran. You wrote that he tripped during pursuit. But I have a video, taken by a neighbor, from her second-story window. It shows you tackling Marcus from behind, unprovoked. Slamming him into the pavement. His only crime was standing outside his friend's house at the wrong time. Kincaid's jaw moved slightly, but no words came out. Alicia wasn't done. You remember Latasha Green? Her son was arrested for loitering in front of his own apartment building. You said he was uncooperative. You said he refused to identify himself. But dispatch confirmed you never even asked his name before forcing him into the squad car. He was 14. Still no sound from Kincaid. His lawyer leaned in but said nothing either. The weight of the room had shifted completely. Alicia reached into her folder again and pulled out one last document. Her voice dropped, but the courtroom leaned in. This is a letter, she said quietly. Dated 8 years ago. It's written by a fellow officer. It was addressed to then-Captain Donald Myers. In it, the officer warns about Todd Kincaid's behavior, his tendency to use unnecessary force, his attitude toward black suspects. The officer who wrote this letter was later transferred and eventually dismissed for unrelated infractions. The letter was never filed. But I found it. Buried in a mislabeled archive. And signed at the bottom, Detective Miles Kincaid. Your brother. Now the gasp came. Audible. Sharp. Kincaid's face cracked, just for a second. Alicia didn't blink. I know why you buried it. I know why your family protected you. But you don't get to hide behind the silence anymore. Not from this room. Not from these people. Not from justice. The judge asked her to submit the letter into evidence. She did. Then, a moment no one could have predicted. Someone stood from the back of the courtroom. A middle-aged black woman, tall, trembling slightly. She raised her hand. The judge looked surprised but allowed her to approach. She introduced herself as Carolyn Fletcher. She had come to watch but brought something with her. A photo of her son. A photo of his bruised face from 5 years ago. No report. No complaint ever filed. No body cam. But she recognized the man who did it the moment she saw Kincaid on TV. She laid the photo on the table. Alicia nodded slowly. And that was it. Like a slow tide, the room turned. The judge recessed for review. Kincaid was escorted out, this time not with badge and weapon, but with an officer at his side, guarding, watching. Outside, people gathered. Some in silence. Others clapping. Not because they celebrated pain or revenge. But because someone had finally done what so many were told was impossible, prove it. And inside, Alicia remained seated. The weight hadn't lifted. Not yet. Because there was still one more file. Still one more truth. One final revelation about how deep this thing really went. And when she opened that last folder, she wasn't just going to take down a man. She was going to expose a system. And the question hung again, heavier now than ever before, when the whole world sees it, will anyone dare to look away? The corridors outside the courtroom were buzzing with quiet energy, reporters whispering into their phones, officers exchanging cautious glances, citizens leaning into each other, unsure if what they had just witnessed was real. Alicia stepped out slowly, her fingers still wrapped around the last folder, the one she hadn't opened yet. Her steps were steady, but her heart was racing. She wasn't afraid. Not of what was in the file, not of what it could do. But she understood what it would mean. That once she spoke what she knew, once she exposed the truth hiding behind the badge, there would be no turning back. Not for her. Not for anyone. Kincaid had been removed from the courtroom quietly, but not without notice. His eyes, once filled with bitter contempt, now looked hollow. Defeated. But Alicia could tell it wasn't just fear, there was something deeper, something gnawing at him that had nothing to do with her. That letter from his brother had hit something raw. Maybe guilt. Maybe shame. Maybe just the shock of being seen in a way he never imagined possible. Not as the enforcer. But as the accused. Back in the hearing room, the judge called for a final session before adjournment. The energy was different now, no longer about one officer's guilt, but something broader, heavier. Alicia knew it was time. She walked back to the front of the room with calm precision and placed the unopened folder on the table in front of her. The judge gave a subtle nod. The silence in the room deepened, as if everyone instinctively knew this wasn't just another exhibit, this was the rupture. Alicia opened the folder slowly and looked down at the top page. Then she looked up, directly into the eyes of the judge, and then the crowd. "This final document contains a memo dated 2 years ago," she began, her voice clear, unshaken. "It was drafted by the department's former internal affairs investigator, Rebecca Lunsford. The memo outlines a deliberate decision by senior officials to suppress over 17 formal complaints against Officer Kincaid, spanning an 8-year period." She paused, letting the words settle. These complaints weren't dismissed due to lack of evidence. They were withheld. Strategically. Categorized as pending review, and then buried under administrative paperwork. In each case, there were known witnesses, photographs, or corroborating details. Yet none were ever pursued. Why? Her hand moved to the second document beneath it. Because each of those cases, every single one, involved black men or women, and pursuing them would have cast a shadow over the department's internal equity metrics. These numbers were being prepared for an annual federal audit. Higher-ups feared the optics. So they chose silence over accountability. The courtroom murmured again, but Alicia wasn't done. Attached to this memo is a list of names, officers, supervisors, and administrators who signed off on these decisions. Among them is now Chief Donald Myers. There was no outrage. No immediate reaction. Just a collective inhale. A slow recognition that what had started as an investigation into one man's actions had now cracked open a truth far more devastating. Someone from the back stood and whispered to another. One of the younger officers left the room, head down. The judge requested a 10-minute recess to review the documents himself. Alicia stepped down, returning to her seat. Her hands trembled slightly now, not from nerves, but from the sheer magnitude of what she'd just released. Kincaid was held in a side room under supervision, awaiting instructions. Alicia was called to speak with him before the final decision was announced. She entered a small, windowless room where he sat alone at the table, hands clasped, eyes sunken. For the first time since this all began, there was no arrogance in his posture. Just silence. He didn't look up when she entered. She waited a moment, then sat across from him. "You knew," she said, not a question, but a truth suspended in the air. He shook his head slowly, eyes on the floor. "I didn't know it all," he muttered. "Not like that. I knew people covered for me. I knew I got away with more than I should have. But I didn't know it was this deep." Alicia studied him, watched his fingers fidget against each other, his breath hitch in small, invisible gasps. He looked broken. Not because he'd been exposed, but because part of him had started to realize that everything he believed was strength had been weakness all along. "You kept doing it," she said quietly. "Even when people begged for help. You kept hurting them." He looked up slowly, his eyes red. "I believed what they told me. That I was doing my job. That they were lying. That I was keeping the streets clean. I stopped asking questions." "You didn't stop," Alicia said. "You never even slowed down." There was a pause, long and cold. Kincaid whispered, "I don't know who I am now." Alicia's face didn't soften, but her voice did. "Maybe that's the first honest thing you've said in years." She stood and turned to leave. But just before she reached the door, he spoke again. "Do you think they'll fix it? After this?" She stopped, hand on the knob. "I don't know," she replied. "But they'll never again be able to say they didn't see it." Back in the courtroom, the judge returned, his expression grave. He acknowledged the findings, confirmed that an independent investigation into the entire department would begin immediately, and placed Officer Todd Kincaid on indefinite suspension pending criminal charges. The room remained quiet. No cheers. No applause. Just the sound of history adjusting itself. Outside, reporters gathered quickly. Questions flew through the air. Alicia walked through them without stopping. She had no interest in spotlight. Her work wasn't done for cameras. It was done for the names on those lists, the ones no one had listened to. Behind her, something remarkable happened. One by one, people in the crowd followed her out, community leaders, activists, families of victims, even a few officers. They didn't say anything. But their silence this time meant something else. It meant solidarity. It meant awareness. It meant, maybe, the first step toward a city remembering how to care for its people. Back in her apartment that night, Alicia sat on the edge of her bed, the files now stacked and closed. She didn't feel victory. Just clarity. Just the stillness of truth finally breathing again after being buried so long. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. For the first time in a long while, she saw herself not just as someone who had survived the system, but as someone who had forced it to see her. And she knew, this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the city of Shreveport changed, but not in the loud, triumphant way people often imagine justice arriving. There were no parades, no citywide speeches, no grand ceremonies. Instead, it was quieter, heavier, more uncertain. Like a collective breath being held. News outlets picked up Alicia's story with cautious headlines, balancing between admiration and unease. National networks ran segments titled, "When the Badge Fails Us," and, "Inside the FBI's Undercover Operation Against a Rogue Officer." But for Alicia, none of the headlines captured the weight of what had happened, not just in that courtroom, but in the soul of the city itself. People began to come forward, slowly at first. Anonymous emails. Handwritten letters. Phone calls from payphones. Former officers who had left the department in frustration, exonerated citizens who had never trusted law enforcement enough to tell their full story, families still grieving quietly in neighborhoods that rarely saw justice arrive at their doors. Each new story added another thread to the web Alicia had exposed. But with those threads came something more complicated: doubt. Distrust. Even resistance. The police department was in chaos. Investigations expanded beyond Kincaid, touching lieutenants, internal affairs officers, and administrators who had once seemed untouchable. But as the inquiries reached deeper, the cracks in the system widened. Alicia was called into meetings with federal attorneys, civil rights commissions, and independent oversight boards. Each time she entered a room, people listened, but not all of them liked what they heard. Some questioned her methods, her motives. Some saw her not as a hero, but as a threat to order. She wasn't naive. She knew exposing the truth didn't always mean people were ready to accept it. But still, the weight of what she had revealed bore consequences, both for others, and for herself. One morning, she received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a single sentence typed on plain white paper: "Not everyone wants the system fixed." There was no signature. No postmark. Just a warning, or perhaps a reminder, that what she had done wasn't universally welcomed. She didn't report it. She didn't speak about it to anyone. She simply folded the paper, placed it in her drawer, and locked it. The message wasn't new. It had just arrived with new boldness. Meanwhile, the city's leadership struggled to contain public outrage. The mayor issued a carefully worded statement about accountability and ensuring community trust, but Alicia could hear the fear in his voice when he spoke. The fear that this wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. Protests emerged, peaceful, organized, but insistent. Activists called for reforms beyond individual punishment: bodycam transparency, civilian oversight committees, community-led policing initiatives. Some residents embraced the momentum, hopeful that real change could come. Others watched with suspicion, weary from years of promises that turned into nothing. Inside the department, morale fractured. Officers were split. Some quietly supported the investigations, grateful that someone had finally stood up. Others seethed, believing Alicia had betrayed the badge. Walls that once held a facade of unity now echoed with mistrust. Friendships dissolved. Loyalties were questioned. For many, the department had become a place of suspicion, not service. And in that environment, fear brewed faster than truth. Alicia remained composed through it all, but the weight pressed harder each day. She found herself questioning things she hadn't questioned in years, not just the system, but the people within it, and herself. She wasn't blind to the irony that, while she had worked from the inside to dismantle injustice, some viewed her with the same suspicion they once reserved for corrupt officers. She had become a symbol, admired, feared, misunderstood. And that symbolism didn't always make space for who she actually was. Late one night, she sat in her car outside a community forum hosted by local youth leaders. She had been invited to speak but hadn't decided whether to go inside. Through the window, she could hear passionate voices discussing what justice should look like now. Not in policy, but in practice. How to rebuild trust when it had been shattered for generations. How to police a community with respect instead of power. And she wondered if change was truly possible when the very foundation had been cracked for so long. Would people ever feel safe again? Would officers ever feel proud again? Could both things exist at once? As she debated stepping inside, a knock on her window startled her. It was a teenage boy, no more than 17. His face was familiar. She'd seen him once during the investigation, a witness who had backed out of testifying at the last minute. He didn't say anything. Just looked at her for a long moment, then offered a small nod before walking away. It was nothing. And yet, it meant everything. A quiet acknowledgement. A thank you. A moment of human connection in the middle of so much noise. Later that week, Alicia was called back to Washington for a debrief with the Civil Rights Unit. The meeting was tense. Senior agents questioned the scale of the exposure. Legal teams debated next steps. Some feared political fallout. Others praised her for bravery. But no one seemed sure of what came next. Alicia sat through the entire session without flinching, answering every question with clarity and conviction. But as she left the building, she realized that justice, once revealed, wasn't an ending. It was a burden. One she had chosen to carry, but one that came with a cost. Kincaid, still awaiting trial, had been moved to another jurisdiction for his own safety. Rumors circulated that he might turn over information on others to lessen his sentence. Alicia didn't care. She hadn't pursued this for revenge. She hadn't wanted him broken. She had wanted the truth. But the truth didn't always satisfy the heart. It left behind a silence filled with complicated emotions, grief, anger, empathy, exhaustion. She knew what Kincaid had done. She knew what he had allowed to happen. And yet, seeing the hollow version of him now, she couldn't help but wonder how many more men like him were out there, men molded by a culture of silence, shaped by unchallenged power, who believed brutality was part of the job. As she prepared to return to Shreveport, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Carolyn Fletcher, the woman who had shown the photo of her son during the hearing. "Thank you. For not walking away. You gave us something we hadn't had in a long time. Hope." Alicia stared at the message for a long time before replying. Her response was simple. "We're just getting started." Back home, she sat on her balcony watching the city lights flicker against the night. The streets below looked the same. Cars moved. People laughed. Life continued. But something had shifted beneath it all, subtle, invisible, but undeniable. She could feel it in the way people looked at her. In the hesitation that turned into courage. In the stories that were finally being told. She knew the fight wasn't over. That systems don't change because of one courtroom victory. That culture doesn't evolve because of headlines. But she also knew that truth had a power nothing could erase. That when one person stood up, others might follow. And that even in the face of resistance, there was always room for transformation. The city was listening now. And soon, it would have to decide what kind of future it wanted to build. The late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the polished floor of the community center, where a crowd had begun to gather for the city's first public forum since the courtroom revelations. It wasn't mandatory, it wasn't formal, but people came, dozens at first, then more, filling folding chairs, standing against walls, carrying the weight of years on their shoulders. Some faces were familiar, parents who had sat in courtrooms and walked out in silence, young men whose names never made the news, elders who had watched injustice shape generations and never thought they'd see a day when someone would stand against it from the inside. Alicia sat near the front, her notepad resting quietly in her lap, her expression unreadable but deeply present. She wasn't there as an agent. Not tonight. She was there as a witness to something larger than her assignment. Something raw. Something real. A moderator introduced the session with a few cautious words, outlining the intention of the evening, to allow the community to speak, to begin healing, and to start shaping what comes next. But the words felt fragile, thin, stretched across years of silence. And then a woman stood, tall, wide-shouldered, her voice trembling slightly, and asked the question that reset the entire room. She didn't ask what would change. She asked why it had taken so long for someone to believe them. She looked straight at Alicia when she said it, not with accusation, but with pain. Alicia stood slowly, nodded once, and spoke with measured breath. She said that believing isn't the same as acting. That fear keeps people quiet, even those with power. That trust isn't a policy, it's a decision, repeated every day. And that what matters now is whether silence wins again, or if truth has finally earned a voice that cannot be buried. The conversation that followed was full of sorrow, but also resolve. A teenage boy stepped forward to share how he used to cross the street when he saw a police cruiser, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he'd learned from others that staying visible could make you a target. An older man admitted he hadn't voted in over a decade because he believed every candidate eventually bowed to the same systems. A young woman, pregnant with her first child, said she feared raising a black son in a place where uniforms had once meant danger more than protection. Each voice carved another mark into the evening, and Alicia listened to them all, feeling the invisible weight of every story press deeper into her chest. After the forum ended, Alicia stayed behind, collecting papers, talking to organizers, answering quiet questions from people who approached her not as an agent but as someone who had opened a door they'd been knocking on for years. One man, his voice hoarse from speaking earlier, approached her with eyes that carried both gratitude and exhaustion. He told her his brother had once been arrested by Kincaid and hadn't spoken about it since. That after the hearing, his brother had finally opened up, crying, shaking, saying he hadn't known if anyone would ever believe him. Alicia didn't say much. Just put a hand gently on the man's shoulder, nodded, and whispered that the truth is never too late. The man smiled with tired eyes and left without another word. That night, Alicia drove through the city without a destination, windows down, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She passed street corners where patrol cars used to linger longer than necessary, she passed murals painted in memory of names the court system never said out loud, and she passed neighborhoods that once flinched at sirens. The city looked the same, but it felt altered, like it had exhaled something heavy, like it was waiting to see if that breath would be taken away again. She parked near a quiet park and sat in silence, watching a group of kids playing near the swings under the dull orange glow of old streetlights. For a moment, she thought about her mother and father, how they would have watched the hearings, what they might have said. Her father would have stayed quiet, nodding when it was all over, only saying one thing, "You did what you had to do." Her mother would have called afterward with a soft but sharp voice, reminding her to stay alert, to stay grounded, to not let the headlines fool her into believing this would be easy now. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from one of the civil rights attorneys who had attended the trial. He had been working quietly with a group of former officers who wanted to come forward, ones who had either witnessed misconduct or been pushed out for speaking up. Alicia's heart skipped. She knew that if enough of them spoke publicly, it would change everything. It wouldn't just be about Kincaid anymore. It would become a case study, a national example. But that also meant it would become political. And political meant dangerous. The following day, she met with two of the former officers in a discreet location. One was a woman named Vanessa Lopez, who had worked internal affairs until she was reassigned for insubordination. The other was Marcus Ellison, a former field supervisor who'd retired early after filing multiple ignored complaints. They came prepared. Vanessa brought files, notes, copies of emails, while Marcus carried only his memory, but his voice was steady and sharp. What they revealed added depth to everything Alicia had already exposed. Not only had the misconduct been known, it had been tolerated, normalized, even rewarded under the guise of aggressive policing. Vanessa shared that she once flagged Kincaid for manipulation of evidence and was told to handle it in-house. When she refused, she was given desk duty. Marcus described a culture where silence was a kind of currency, those who kept quiet moved up, those who spoke up disappeared. They both agreed to testify if needed. Alicia sat with them for over 2 hours, recording everything, asking questions only when absolutely necessary. She didn't want to interrupt the flood of truth that had waited too long to be heard. As she drove home, the sun dipped low behind the horizon, and the sky bled into a soft orange haze. She thought about the weight of legacy, the legacy of officers like Kincaid, yes, but also of systems built to protect them. And she thought about the cost of changing that legacy, about how every name added to the record was a person whose life had been paused, broken, or altered by silence. And in the quiet of her car, she asked herself something she hadn't asked in years, not whether she was doing the right thing, but whether she could sustain the fight long enough to make sure it mattered. Back at home, Alicia received a call from someone she hadn't expected, Detective Miles Kincaid. The brother. The one who had written the letter buried deep in the files. His voice was low, rough from years of smoke and bitterness, but there was something else, remorse. He said he wanted to talk. Not to defend his brother, but to explain what went wrong. Alicia hesitated, then agreed. They met in a small diner, quiet and mostly empty, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Miles looked tired. Older than his age. He told her he tried to stop Todd once, years ago. That he saw the signs early, the aggression, the entitlement, but no one listened. He wrote that letter because he couldn't stomach it anymore. But after it disappeared, he knew the department had made its choice. He left shortly after. Alicia listened without speaking, then finally asked why he was reaching out now. His answer was simple. Because when he watched the hearing, and saw what she'd done, he realized that silence had cost too much. That maybe there was still time to speak before it took more from him. They sat for a long time in that diner, two people linked by damage and duty, neither of them expecting forgiveness, both of them quietly hoping the truth might still offer something like peace. When they parted, Miles left a flash drive on the table. Internal memos, call logs, stuff I kept when I thought someone might one day need it, he said. Alicia took it without a word, knowing it might be the key to something bigger. Something no one was ready for. As she walked into the night, the city around her seemed to breathe again, not healed, not whole, but moving. Alicia knew the end wasn't here yet. But for the first time, it felt like they were walking toward it, and not running from it. And whatever waited at the end, the truth would meet it first. The next morning, Alicia sat at her kitchen table staring at the flash drive Detective Miles Kincaid had left behind. The weight of it wasn't in its size, but in the implication of what it could contain, proof, details, connections that could push the entire investigation into irreversible territory. She had spent her career building cases, learning to separate instinct from evidence, learning to ask questions even when the answers scared her. But this time felt different. This time, the answers wouldn't just expose corruption, they would burn through names, reputations, institutions. And once that flame started, it wouldn't stop. She inserted the drive into her laptop and opened the main folder. It was organized meticulously, with subfolders labeled by year and by name. Internal memos between captains. Redacted files with full versions restored. Communications from high-ranking officials instructing officers to alter reports for media safety. At the center of it all, Alicia found a single spreadsheet that made her blood run cold, a list of documented but suppressed complaints, filtered by race, labeled sensitive, with notes beside them like delay processing, revisit next cycle, and worst of all, unlikely to escalate. Dozens of names. Real people. Cases that should have been prosecuted, investigated, addressed, but instead, they were managed. Hidden. Buried beneath paperwork and silence. Later that afternoon, she sat across from her direct superior at the FBI field office. He was a man she respected, but also someone who had warned her, more than once, that her passion, though admirable, could be seen as antagonism. She laid the flash drive on the table and waited for his reaction as he scrolled through the files. His face hardened with each click, and finally, he leaned back and let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "You know what this means, right?" he asked, voice low. "I do," Alicia replied calmly. "But I need to hear you say it." He tapped the desk, looking at her like he wished she didn't already know the answer. "If we go public with this, the backlash won't stop with the department. It'll hit the bureau, too. Questions about oversight. Complicity. There will be people who say we let this happen, that we covered it up just by not knowing." She didn't flinch. "Then we answer those questions. We hold ourselves accountable, too." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of just how much courage that would take. "You're risking your entire career, Alicia. And not everyone's going to thank you for it." She leaned forward, eyes sharp. "I didn't take this job to be thanked. I took it to tell the truth. To make it mean something." There was a long silence between them. Finally, he nodded once. "Then I'll back you. But be ready, for all of it." Later that week, Alicia was called to testify before a closed session of the State Attorney General's office. The mood in the room was heavy, professional, but tense. No one doubted her credibility, but some questioned her timing. Others questioned the implications. A senior advisor asked if she had considered how many careers would be ruined if the files were released. Alicia responded without hesitation. "How many lives have already been ruined by the silence?" The room went quiet. She had made her point. That night, as Alicia walked out of the courthouse, she found Miles waiting on a bench just outside the main entrance. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded at her. She sat beside him, the cool evening air wrapping around them in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I used to think if I stayed quiet long enough, it would all blow over. That the system would clean itself." She looked at him, not with anger, but with a truth he couldn't escape. "But it didn't." "No," he admitted, voice rough. "It got worse. And now, my brother's name is going to be in every paper for the next decade." Alicia didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was steady but soft. "Because he made it that way. He chose power over people. Again and again." "I know," Miles said, eyes fixed on the pavement. "And I hated him for it. Still do. But I also remember when we were kids, before the badge, before the bitterness. He wanted to be a hero. I don't know when that changed." Alicia breathed deeply. Maybe it never changed. Maybe he just believed the wrong things about what a hero looks like. They sat there for a while longer, the sounds of the city humming gently around them. No solutions. No closure. Just the difficult stillness of two people trying to unwrite history, one truth at a time. The following days moved like waves: meetings, press briefings, documents verified and handed off to journalists brave enough to run with them. Alicia became a reluctant face of the reckoning, requested by media outlets, studied in classrooms, cited by civil rights groups. But even as her name rose, she remained grounded, focused on the real work. She attended community discussions. She sat with victims' families. She reviewed reform proposals and offered corrections, pushing for lasting changes instead of performative apologies. And yet, not everything was victory. Her car was keyed one night outside her apartment. A death threat was scrawled in marker across her building's front door. She received anonymous calls with heavy breathing and silence. But each time, she documented it, handed it off, and continued her work. Fear, she knew, was a tactic. And she refused to be moved by it. One afternoon, she received a call from Carolyn Fletcher. The two hadn't spoken since the hearing. Carolyn asked if Alicia could meet her at a local school, where a memorial was being held for families impacted by police violence. Alicia arrived to find dozens gathered in a small auditorium. There were photos of sons and daughters lost, some dead, others broken by systems they never recovered from. Alicia stood quietly in the back, absorbing the weight of every story etched into those walls. When Carolyn took the mic, she surprised everyone. She didn't speak of pain. She spoke of rebuilding. Of trust slowly mending. Of people finally being seen. And then, she called Alicia to the stage. As Alicia walked forward, applause rose, not thunderous, but warm, grateful, real. She stood behind the podium, eyes sweeping the room, then focused on the rows of children sitting near the front. Her voice didn't tremble. I didn't come here today as a hero. I came here as a witness. To remind you that power is only real when it's held accountable. That justice is not just about punishment, it's about truth. And that every name we say here today matters. Because the system didn't see them. But we do. And we always will. After the event, a young boy approached her, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with wide eyes and a quiet voice. He held out a folded drawing, a woman standing tall in front of a building with fire behind her and light in her hands. He said he'd drawn it for school, that she was the one in the picture. Alicia crouched down, looked at the drawing, and asked him why he gave her light instead of a weapon. His answer was simple. Because you fought with the truth. She hugged him gently, whispering thank you, and tucked the drawing into her bag like it was made of gold. That night, back in her apartment, Alicia placed the drawing beside her badge. She stared at both for a long time. Symbols of two sides of the same battle. One built for order. The other for hope. And she realized, in that moment, that her fight had never been about tearing things down. It had always been about rebuilding something better. The city was changing. Slowly. Painfully. But it was changing. And now, it was time to ask what came next. 3 months later, the trial of Todd Kincaid came to an end. The courtroom was smaller this time, not filled with reporters or national coverage, but packed with faces that mattered, those who had lived the consequences of silence. Kincaid sat at the defense table not as a symbol of untouchable power, but as a man facing the reckoning of his choices. He didn't speak much during the proceedings. His attorney did the work, arguing for leniency, citing his years of service, his mental health, his supposed ignorance of the broader corruption. But the evidence was overwhelming. His victims testified, not all, but enough. Alicia didn't watch every minute. She didn't need to. She knew that the damage he caused wouldn't be measured in years sentenced but in trust that took generations to rebuild. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of civil rights violations, falsifying reports, and obstruction, Kincaid didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He only lowered his head. And in that stillness, for the first time, it seemed like he was beginning to understand the full weight of what he had done. He was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole for the first 10. Miles Kincaid, after testifying voluntarily, chose to leave Shreveport. He moved to a quiet town in Oregon and started working with a nonprofit focused on law enforcement ethics and whistleblower protection. He and Alicia exchanged occasional emails, updates, stories, no sentimentality, just two people who had shared a battlefield. In one of his messages, he told her he was finally sleeping without guilt. That meant more to her than he probably knew. Vanessa Lopez and Marcus Ellison, the two former officers who had come forward, were offered consulting roles in helping the department implement the reforms that had resulted from the investigation. It wasn't a full redemption, but it was a return to purpose. They worked closely with a newly formed civilian oversight board, something Alicia had quietly helped push for behind the scenes. Together, they helped restructure training programs, rewrite internal reporting procedures, and facilitate restorative justice sessions between officers and affected community members. They didn't fix everything. But they started something real. As for Alicia, she was offered a promotion, two, actually. One in D.C., a high-ranking position that would pull her away from the field. Another in Atlanta, allowing her to lead a regional task force focused on systemic accountability. She turned them both down. Instead, she submitted a proposal to open a new division under the Civil Rights Bureau, headquartered in Shreveport, dedicated to early intervention, education, and community-rooted oversight. Her proposal was approved. The city that had once swallowed the truth would now host the heart of something better. The opening of the new division was quiet but powerful. No red carpets, no speeches for cameras. Just people, educators, activists, survivors, officers, citizens, standing together to build something they never thought possible. Alicia stood at the back of the room, watching it unfold, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled not because something ended but because something had finally begun. The mural painted outside the building showed three silhouettes, a boy with his hands raised toward the sky, a woman standing with a folder pressed to her chest, and a man removing a badge and handing it over willingly. Beneath the image, a single phrase in bold white letters, "Truth is a duty, not a weapon." As the weeks passed, Alicia began teaching a course at the local university. It wasn't about policing or law enforcement. It was about ethics, integrity, the psychology of silence, the price of complicity. Her class filled quickly. Her students came from every background, future lawyers, teachers, counselors, organizers. They came not to be told what to think, but to learn how to face difficult truths and stand inside them. One day, after class, a student waited until everyone left and asked her a question that hit deeper than he realized. "How do you keep doing it, when it hurts so much to carry?" Alicia looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said it wasn't about not hurting. It was about choosing not to turn away. That pain isn't the enemy, apathy is. And the reason she could keep going wasn't because she was fearless. It was because the people who trusted her didn't have the luxury of fearlessness. So she refused to waste hers. Her life didn't return to normal, because it never would. But it found a new rhythm. She still woke early. Still walked to her favorite diner on Sunday mornings. Still carried the same leather folder tucked beneath her arm. But now, when people stopped her on the street, it wasn't to whisper fears. It was to share stories. Victories. New beginnings. And then, one evening, as she walked past the park where the children played under orange streetlights, she saw something that stopped her, two patrol officers playing a game of pickup basketball with a group of teenagers. No tension. No fear. Just laughter, sneakers against pavement, and the kind of ordinary joy that systems so often forget to protect. She stood there for a long time, watching, smiling quietly. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like the fight was winning. Now, if you've been with us from the beginning, you know this story wasn't about just one officer or one courtroom. It was about power. About silence. About what happens when someone refuses to let either of those things win. Alicia Monroe stood alone at first, but not for long. Because when one voice rises with truth, it creates space for others to speak. And when enough voices rise together, the silence no longer stands a chance. So now we ask you, the listener, the viewer, the witness, what kind of silence have you tolerated? What systems have you allowed to remain comfortable? What stories are still waiting to be heard in your community, your city, your world? Because justice isn't a one-time event. It's a habit. A choice. A muscle that grows stronger every time we decide to use it. Tell us in the comments, what did this story make you feel? What part resonated most with you? And more importantly, what would you do if you were in Alicia's place? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you hope, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are more stories to tell, and together, we can make sure they're heard. We'll see you in the next one.